his company and mine may go into partnership. So
Really?
Wow.
That'd be a nice
We
start.
are live on YouTube. Hello, good evening, social media. We're going to get the music started here and let everybody in the room. We have a great program lined up for you this evening. Thanks for joining us with Veterans Breakfast Club. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Veterans Breakfast Club, Greatest Generation Live for Thursday, January 30th. As I mentioned the other day, can you believe we're already through January and this is our last GGL of January? It's crazy to think that we've already blown through a month and had, what, eight or nine episodes already with Veterans Breakfast Club. So thank you all for joining us this evening. Barb, it's good to see you again. Are you still beaming to us from Barcelona? Barb Smith, are you still in Spain? No, are you back?
he's back in Madrid, she said.
Back in Madrid? Okay. So I was going to say, you're probably the furthest away then of anybody joining us tonight. It's good to see you all. And we have your host, Glenn Flickinger, here on with us as well. Glenn, how are you?
I'm doing fine, Sean. Thank you very much. Nice to see everybody again. Hopefully we have some new guests on tonight. Welcome, everybody. And we have, I think, a pretty interesting show tonight, a different program than from a different sort of perspective than we've had maybe ever in the past. But that's kind of what we try to do, is bring different perspectives, not only different aspects of the war, some aspects of the war, like that Caribbean show that was so good a couple weeks ago, that are so little known. This is looking at the war from, let's say, the other side of the hill, which is a phrase quite used in World War II historical literature. It's looking at it from the enemy point of view. So, it's kind of a different program tonight. I hope everybody appreciates it.
Thank you, Glenn. We'll dive right in here in just a sec, but we do want to greet all our members here, but also anybody new to us. We're the Veterans Breakfast Club. Our mission is creating communities of listening around veterans and their stories to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. We've been around for 16 years. We do this every Monday and Thursday night on Zoom. If you live in the Pittsburgh region, we also do in-person breakfast. That'll start back up in April. Please check out our website, www.veteransbreakfastclub.org, for all of our upcoming programs. You can check out our new magazine digitally on the website, as well as our blog, past events, and we invite you to also become a donor of the VBC to help support us and our mission. But hand it off to you, Glenn, and let's kick things off here.
Okay, thank you, Sean. So before we get started, I want to apologize to anybody who last week, towards the end of the program, we got kind of long, and there were a couple of people who were looking to be recognized that I just didn't notice. So if we missed you, I really apologize, and specifically to Don Patton, who is just such a great loyal member and such an important part of the World War II history community. He was looking to be recognized, and I didn't notice him. So Don, I think I see your iPhone on. I'm not sure you're on video yet, but maybe you're listening. Truly sorry to anybody that we miss.
I'll echo that. I also, I'm trying to keep it I'm watching from a different version of Zoom. I'm watching a bigger screen of just you, Glenn, your pretty face. So I see less of everybody else.
You don't want any bigger picture of me. I mean, you ought to kind of try to minimize it.
Well, I tend to miss things. So what's nice is that if anybody's watching more of a view of everybody and you see someone waving their hand like this, just put it in the chat, say, hey, Sean, Don has his hand up or whatever. And then we can make sure to recognize somebody that if we are, missing them. So apologies, but please let us know if there's any hands being raised and we haven't seen them yet.
Thanks, Sean. Okay, so we have two very well-known, incredibly valuable members of the VBC on tonight as our guests. Marilyn Walton. Marilyn, wave your hand, say hello for us, please.
Hi, good evening. Good to see
Marilyn,
you.
I think you remember Marilyn, and this is sort of an offshoot of her expertise in POWs during World War II, particularly in Germany, of course. with the Air Force POWs. And I don't know how many programs we did last year on that topic, but a lot, half a dozen or more. This is kind of an offshoot. At least the original idea came from that. We'll explain that in a minute. Marilyn, thank you so much, as always, for being with us. We value your input.
Thank you.
And then Colin Heaton, who I can't remember whether Marilyn introduced me to Colin or Colin to Marilyn, but they sort of come as a team in lots of different ways. They've done a lot of work together. And Colin, really pleased to have you on again, as you're on almost every week.
Yeah, I try to make a presence.
And you do, Colin. I mean, the sweatshirt and the microphone and those books in the back, I mean, they're impressive.
Yeah, wait till I put the ski mask on with the shades and I go incognito.
We might call in some anti-terrorist group at that point. And I welcome all of you. I see Doug Doer. I haven't seen you, Doug. Maybe I've just missed you for a couple of weeks, Doug, but it's nice to have you. Brad, as always. Thank you, Brad. Is our favorite World War II veteran?
Yes, Ed Cottrell is on. I asked you to unmute, Ed.
Hello, Ed. I think we're getting you to unmute. There you go.
I'm unmuted.
Okay. Ed, it's always a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you. It's a great time. I'm anxious to hear this tonight.
So am I, actually. So the work is really done by Colin and Marilyn. I just helped sort of organize the stories. Lots of different stories that we could have chosen. We came down to these 6 or so. I hope we get to them all. It depends. Let me put up this PowerPoint and get started. Okay.
Ben,
Yes.
can I say hello to my friend Scott? I haven't talked to him for a while, and to Terry and Barb and all my other friends that I know. So nice to see you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Say hello to everybody. Party at Ed's house this Saturday, by the way. We can all head down there to nice Asheville. It's a great place. I love Asheville. I hope it's recovered a lot. So
It's recovered. It looks good.
Ed, you might have a couple dozen guests come this Saturday.
Well, if they are, I won't be there because I'm doing a speech at 1:00
Ah,
at I think it's going to be somewhere between 125 and 150 people have registered. So it'll be a fun couple hours.
yeah. I'm sure you'll wow them. I love your stories.
Okay.
Okay. So let me get this up here and we'll get the program started. And there we go. So I'm guessing many of you have read a book called A Higher Call by Adam Makos. Came out, whoops, let me start a different one. I'm sorry. There's 2 pieces of this story I wanted to start with. First one was that this story really comes out of the documentary that we screened 4 or 5 months ago, I think last fall, Lost Airmen of Buchenwald, which Marilyn played an important part in. We screened that and then had Marilyn help me out, remind me of the producer. Yeah, on and had a great discussion about it. And during that film and during the discussion, these 2 men's name came up. Adolf Galan, who's the famous fighter pilot during World War II, and Hans, and I think I may have spelled this wrong, Colin, is it Trotloff or Trotloff?
I corrected it for you. It's Troutloft.
Trotloff, thank you. And I'll ask Marilyn and Colin to give us just a quick rendition of how these 2 airmen, German airmen, Luftwaffe men, played such an important role in saving the 168 Allied airmen at Buchenwald.
Well, let Marilyn go first. She can give you the background.
Okay, Marilyn?
Colin actually knew these men and interviewed them, but I was unaware. In fact, that's how I met Colin, actually, after I read A Higher Call. And at the time that I worked with Mike Dorsey on The Lost Airmen of Buchenwald, we had hoped to figure out who the Luftwaffe officer was who came in and saved the 168. But we never did. And until I read it in A Higher Call, I was just casually reading it one day, and there was that name Troutloff that I hadn't heard before. And when I looked and I realized that it was Colin that knew him, I got in touch with Makos, and they put me in touch with Colin, as I recall. And he told me more about him and more of the details. We would have liked to have had that in the documentary, but at the time we just didn't have it. So it was very fortuitous that I read the book, and then Colin and I are now history. But he knew them. He can tell you even more.
And Colin, I think you've told this story on our program before, but just quickly repeat it. How did you come to the realization that it was Troutloff, who was the German Luftwaffe general, I think, or officer, who visited Buchenwald and set in motion the freedom of the 168 Allied airmen?
Well, it's multifaceted. First, in 1984, I was doing dozens of interviews when I was living in Germany, and Troutloff was introduced to me by Galland, and I was there with Hannes and Marga, and we were just talking about his career, about what he'd done, just typical history stuff. And then she said, and she spoke very good English, and she said, "Tell him about the Americans and people that you found in that prison camp." And he said, "Oh, that was nothing. That was just a mistake." And I was too stupid to follow up on it, because I figured, well, there were dozens of POW camps. I wasn't thinking about it. And we were talking about Spanish Civil War and World War II that he was involved in. And then later on, I had many interviews with other German officers, Johannes Steinhoff for one, and I published a couple of books with all the full interviews with some of these guys. And then I was watching the History Channel back in 2012, I think, and I'm watching this, and it said, Lost Airmen of Buchenwald, and I'm thinking, oh, this might be interesting. Let's see if there's something I don't know. And then I was watching it, and it's like, the German officer, the colonel, came to the gate and was talking to I'm like, wait a minute, that sounds familiar. And then I went back into my old interviews, and it took me like a week. And I found Steinhoff's interview where he and Galland both had mentioned Troutloff had found these prisoners of war in Weimar. Well, Weimar is where Buchenwald was, but the word Buchenwald was never mentioned. Even my conversation with Karl Wolff, SS General Karl Wolff, who was involved in this from the other side of it, never mentioned the name Buchenwald, but said Himmler was so angry when these prisoners were let out that he threw his glass against the wall and broke it. But it never connected. No one ever said the name Buchenwald. I didn't know it. But then I figured, wait a minute. So I began doing some digging, investigations. I called a couple of guys that were still alive in Germany, and I kind of pieced it together. So I took a random series of photographs, kind of like a police lineup, and I shot a lot of photos out to Adam Makos, and I said, get these to the guys, the four guys, especially Carter, get these photographs and see if they can pick out who that officer was. I've got some candidates, but I think I know who it is. And he came back like maybe in a month or so and said, well, they all pointed to Troutloff. And I'm like, well, that's good enough for me.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Sorry. My apologies. Wow. Interesting that you sent almost like a police lineup and everybody pointed to Troutloff. And by that point, as I understand too, once you knew it was Troutloff, unfortunately, he had passed.
He died in 96, I believe.
Yeah, so long past. Yeah. And explain to the audience, some of them who might not know the story, what did Troutloff do?
Well, what happened was the mayor in the town was not a Nazi. He was a very anti-Nazi kind of guy. He was a World War I veteran. I believe he had been captured by the British, very well treated. But, there were several German industries around there that used the slave labor in Buchenwald. Most were Jews. Some were just political prisoners, but a lot of them were Allied POWs who were just wrapped into this nightmare. They had an ammunition factory, a parachute factory, a uniform factory, and they had a facility for making tail fins for V1 flying, for V2 rockets. And then so this guy kind of like found out that there were some of these people in the camp that shouldn't be there, and he sent somehow he got word to a friend of his in Berlin, and then there was a big bombing mission. And so Hermann Goering told Galland, I need to know how much damage was done to German industry and how much the Luftwaffe is going to suffer. Fuel, aircraft parts, uniforms, parachutes, ammunition. Get me an inventory of what the hell happened. So he sends Troutloff, who was his inspector of day fighters. Galland was a major general at the time. Troutloff was a colonel, and he was in charge of day fighter operations. So Troutloff's driving around. He's driving around for like 3 or 4 weeks, checking out all these areas. And then he and his driver happen to make a wrong turn, and then he happens to pull up to this place with a bunch of trees, and he goes, "Oh, looks like there's a factory there." He pulls in, no, it's a prison camp. He goes up there and he's looking in, and he sees the SS are running it, and then one of the prisoners runs up to him talking in German, and from what I understand, he said, "Herr Oberst, wir bist alliierten Flugsoldaten, wie mir nicht hier, das ist gegen Geneva." And he's like, what are you talking about? What the hell is this place? And Troutloff was from Thuringia, which is where Weimar is. So he didn't even know this camp existed in this capacity. And Troutloff, after about a 5-minute conversation, from what we gathered, had enough information to tell the SS guard to open the gate. Well, even an SS sergeant's not, you got a full colonel, a Knight's Cross, and the full decorations package walking in. Troutloff goes straight to the commandant's office. Well, the commandant, Hermann Pister, was on leave, but the captain, his adjutant, was there. And he said, "What is it about these Allied prisoners being here? And what the hell is this place?" And apparently he found out that it was a concentration camp, which he knew about, but no one knew about death camps at that time. Most people didn't know. So he picks up the phone, calls Galland in Berlin. He knows Galland's phone is tapped by Heinrich Himmler of the SS. He says, "I have a situation here with some prisoners, and I need to discuss it with you immediately." And he said, and Galland goes, "Okay, do the assessment, get back to Berlin." He goes back to Berlin. He tells Galland about these 168 guys he says, from what he understood, they were probably going to be killed. And Galland said, "Okay, we have to take this to Erhard Milch, who was second in command of the Luftwaffe." They go to Milch. Milch says, "Above my pay grade, let's go to Goering." And Goering, who hated Himmler, said, "Okay, get him out. You have my authority, but don't tell anybody else." So Troutloff then organizes a rescue, and they go by train, and they send some trucks. And then in the early hours, one morning, they pull in, catch the SS off guard, and start pulling these guys out with Hermann Goering's authorization. And they get them out of there. And no sooner had the last truck been loaded when the phone call was finally placed through to Heinrich Himmler, and Himmler found out about it. He told Gottlob Berger, commandant of concentration camps, Berger ordered an SS detachment to go in and basically kill anybody helping these prisoners escape, because Himmler had given an order. These prisoners were to never be transferred to any other camp because they would know too much. They had to be killed eventually, and he gave an execution date. Marilyn can give you more about that. And so they got him out, and they ended up going to Stalag Luft 3 and a few other places.
And Marilyn, there had been an execution order issued, and had they been there another couple of days?
I believe it was about 3 days later. Had they been there 3 days later, they all would have been executed. And of course, they had already executed the some RAF prisoners that they were also holding there, and they hanged them by piano wire. Very grisly, and a lot of them. So the Americans got out, and thanks to Troutloff. And by the time they got to Stalag Luft 3, they thought that was a country club compared to where they had been. Yeah. And they left 2 behind, and who were really sick, and they were in the infirmary, which sounds like a nice hospital, but if you went there, you really went there to die at Buchenwald. So thankfully, one of those got out, and he eventually made it to Stalag Luft 3 as well.
So here's the question. Were these 2 men, Galland and Troutloff particularly, were they acting out of their humanity for these men? Were they acting out of loyalty to other airmen? What drove them to take the risk to free these to move these 168 men?
Well, first of all, Hannes Troutloff learned about the Holocaust in 1943. His fiancée, Marga, whom he married after the war, was Jewish. Galland learned about the death camps, And both men, as fighter Geschwaderkommandoren, had issued orders that their men were to never kill a helpless enemy. And if a man parachutes out, then he's free and clear. And if a man's helpless, give him a chance to bail out. You don't just kill wantonly. And which will follow into the next segment on Hans Marseille. But they were both very honorable men, and they did not believe in killing helpless people. And they firmly believed in the adherence to Geneva of 1929. And they were really, truly gentlemen. Despite the regime they fought for, they were very honorable men.
Yeah. And that's what the idea that in the next story, the quick story we're going to tell about Adam Makos's book, A Higher Calling. That's what led us to this idea, us being Marilyn, Colin, and myself with Todd's input, to tell some of these other stories that are less well known that you're going to hear in a few minutes. Okay. And Marilyn, why don't you tell the audience about the last living airman of those 168 airmen and his passing just in the last few days?
Right. That would be Stanley Booker. For those of us who have tried to figure out how many are left of the 168, it's been determined pretty much that Stanley was the last one. Of course, Pat was on the program with us when we did the Buchenwald stories.
Pat is his daughter.
His daughter, yeah. And she's been in touch. They're going to live stream his funeral. She hasn't given me the date yet, but he was 102, a member of the British Empire, very accomplished man after the war. And she very eloquently told his story, I know, when she was on, but he just died a few days ago.
Yeah.
So he was the last of the 168.
Yeah. Pretty fascinating man who I read his obituary, and we talked to Pat a while ago. And just think, that man passed at 102. He could have passed at whatever it was, 20 or 22, 80-some years ago, had it not been for the action of these two men. So,
Right.
pretty sobering story.
Mm-hmm.
The next story we want to tell rather quickly, and they're related, we've already mentioned this. I'm sure many of you have read A Higher Call by Adam Makos. I think that was his first book, as I recall, 12, 15 years ago. And I know you know him very well, Colin.
Yeah, I proofread his manuscript and corrected his mistakes.
I need you to do the same for me, Colin, because this story is the story of these two men you see on the cover of the book. And if I could get my cursor to work, I'll go to the next page. Here it is. There we are. Franz Stigler, the German fighter ace, and Charlie Brown. What a fascinating American name to have. From West Virginia, as I recall. Very young, maybe one of the younger B-17 pilots. I think he was 19 or 20 when he became a B-17 pilot, something like that. And the story here is, in maybe just a minute or two, Colin, what is the story here for those who have not read the book or heard about this?
Well, the story was that Franz was at his base in northern Germany. Charlie's group had just bombed and were headed back, and they'd taken a lot of fighter and flak damage. And then Charlie's B-17 flew right over Franz's airfield, and he had the order to alarm start, go up and shoot him down. So Franz jumps in his 109, takes off. He gets up close to it. He sees first of all, he sees dead men. He just cruises along both sides of this bomber, and he's like, I can't kill these guys. They've taken too much punishment. This would be murder. So he escorts them halfway across the English Channel, waves, waggles his wings, and comes back, but never said a word because he could have been court-martialed and executed. So that's pretty much it.
And Franz Stigler was a Catholic from the Bavaria, as I recall.
Correct. He was a student priest until he discovered girls.
Yeah, I have a couple of friends who went the same way. Was the furthest thing from a Nazi you can imagine, but yet was an accomplished fighter pilot. Ends up after this flying with Golan with the Me-262s.
Yeah.
And then the other fascinating part of this story is that the two of them find each other again. Oops, I'm trying to go the other way and I'm going the wrong way here. Try to find each other again, do find each other again after the war. And that's the picture here in the middle of them probably in the 90s, maybe early 2000s, together, and they became great friends. Yeah. There's a part of Adam's book, I remember reading it, and it was probably one of the first times I thought about this. So Adam, I think, was early 20s, late teens when he wrote this book, something like
I think he was 24.
24. Okay. But he'd written a magazine for a long time. He had an interest in World War II aviation since he was very young. And he always wrote, whatever he interviewed, it was from the American or from the Allied point of view. And as I recall, he had a lot of trouble when he started to understand Franz Stigler's story, because he just assumed anybody that was German in World War II, particularly someone who was a fighter ace, would have been a hardened Nazi who would never take an action like this.
Yeah.
It was eye-opening to him that there was this kind of humanity out there in the German military or in Germany at all.
Well, Adam's not alone. I mean, when Schindler's List came out, I think it shocked a lot of people.
Yeah, exactly.
If you go to YouTube, you can see them reunite. They were filmed when they met at a hotel at one point, in their conversation back and forth, and it's really endearing to watch them. It's easy to find on YouTube.
Yeah. And I knew Franz Stigler. I think I introduced Adam to Franz anyway, but and Franz flew with Marseille as well. So, and he even admitted he inherited his chivalrous streak because of what Marseille used to do.
Interesting. Well, we'll get to Marseille in a little bit here. Okay. So let me pull down the PowerPoint and stop, because from here we're going to get into a few other stories that are, I think, less well known than the two we just went into, and ask if we can answer any questions or if there's any comments from the audience so far.
I think, Colin, you answered the one question that was in here, correct?
Which one?
Let's see here.
About being chased?
Here we go. Doug Dwar. Was it true that Buchenwald POWs were told by American authority to never discuss their internment at Buchenwald?
Yes, and Marilyn can verify that.
Yes, it's very true.
The original program we had on this was with the son of one of the Buchenwald,
Rick Martini.
Rick Martini, and he has a book out called Betrayed,
Mhm.
which I read last year sometime, and
I edited.
and Marilyn edited, and it goes in detail into that.
Mhm.
The reason it's called Betrayed is that his father felt betrayed by the government, in that it was never recognized what happened to him and the other airmen there. And it wasn't just the U.S. government, it was all the Allied governments. Was it not?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Every single Allied government put a basic top secret lid on, and the British were the worst.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And the reasoning behind it is still, I don't know, vague to me. I think I understand what Rick, put in his book as the reasoning, and I see that as kind of true. But
Well, I can speak to it as far as this Stalag 3, when they arrived there, the senior officers told them not to discuss it, because a lot of the prisoners there were not aware of the concentration camps, and if the men had spoken about what happened to them at Buchenwald, they thought there would just be really panic in the camp, and really upset them at that point. But that was while they were prisoners of war. After the war, they were still encouraged not to do it. And as prisoners of war, if they were told something, they listened to it. And for decades, they went by that. And then when they did finally open up when they were older, nobody believed them at all. And so they just stopped talking about it altogether.
yeah, very sad in so many ways,
It
because
was.
it impacted their benefits after the war as well.
Mhm.
And many of them, like Rick's father, because of that experience, was negatively affected in many ways. I mean, that's an understatement, I think, to say negatively affected.
Right. And all the glory at that point was going to Werner von Braun, which is the other part of the book, as a hero who had been a solid Nazi.
Yeah.
And when Operation Paperclip, when they all came over here, I know that's one thing that Rick really resented, all that glory after what happened to his father.
Well, I think the reason why they were sworn to secrecy was because they were trying to rehabilitate West Germany after the war. And with all the scientists and doctors and researchers coming into Britain and America, and with von Braun, the Peenemünde Project with Walter Dornberger was predicated upon 3 camps: Auschwitz-Birkenau, Dachau, and Buchenwald. That's because they used talented slave labor to build the components for the V-2 rockets.
Right. And many died doing that.
Okay. And if there's other comments or questions, if not, we'll move on to these other stories. Let me go
Go
back.
ahead. Yeah, I think you can go ahead.
Okay. Everybody seeing this? Okay. So we've got 2 or 3 stories that Colin's going to tell and 2 or 3 stories that Marilyn's going to tell. We're going to go back and forth. We thought we'd cover all the bases, not just the European theater, but also the Japanese or the Pacific theater. So Colin, tell us about this man.
He was a good friend of mine, Saburo Sakai. He was a very good guy, and he started out as a surface Navy guy in the Japanese Navy in the late 30s. And then he applied to flight school as an enlisted man and graduated as a petty officer 2nd class from flight school. Began flying combat in the Philippines, where he shot down the first B-17 lost in World War II, killing a man named Colin P. Kelly. Then, during the Indonesia campaign, as the Japanese were taking over hitting the oil fields, they were told to sweep the skies of any Dutch aircraft. Well, Saburo and 2 of his wingmen, they flew in three ship formations, the Japanese did, and they called the Keta formation by the Germans. Anyway, they took off, and Saburo by that time had about maybe a dozen kills. So they came across this DC-3 from KLM, a civilian chartered aircraft flying
The Dutch airline, yeah.
The Dutch airline. They were flying towards Australia. They were on a direct heading south east to Australia. And Saburo flew alongside, and he saw it was packed with women and children. And they didn't have radios in their zeros because it limited range. So he slid his canopy back and waved off Ota and the other pilot, I think it was Nishizawa. He waved them off and gave the sign, "We're not going to shoot this aircraft down." So he flew alongside and saw a blonde-haired lady. He told me, blonde-haired lady, a lot of children, the children just waving at him like, "Oh, there's an airplane," and he looked over and thought, "This isn't Bushido. This isn't the way of the samurai. I can't kill these people." Then he flew alongside the cockpit, and he said he saw looks of horror on the pilot and co-pilot. And then he gave them an okay sign, waved, saluted, waggled his wings, and pointed like, "Okay, keep going, you're okay." And then they peeled away. That was in 1942. 1976 or so. And in this photograph here, second from the left is Saburo. I believe Ota is to the left, and Lieutenant Junichi Sasai is far right, top row, and Nishizawa is top row, far left. He was the top Japanese ace of the war. Saburo had 64 kills. But anyway, after the war, Saburo went to a reunion in Australia, and he met the co-pilot of that DC-3 that he allowed to keep flying. And that pilot and his wife, his daughter, and grandchildren were there to thank Sakai for not killing them. And he said, "That is not my way." Sakai got into a lot of trouble in Japan after the war because when he was stationed in China, his first duty station, he saw the atrocities the Japanese army was committing. Now, he was Navy. And after the war, he kept telling the Japanese government, "We need to be like the Germans. We need to accept the fact that we committed war crimes. Our people murdered civilians. We killed people. We did terrible things. We need to atone for it." And they ostracized him. They blackballed him. He was blacklisted from Japanese society, other than among his own comrades. But the thing was, because of his position on atonement and clarity and acceptance of Japanese war crimes, his best friend became Marine Corps Medal of Honor winner Fighter Ace Joe Foss, who I knew quite well.
Wow.
And Joe Foss called Saburo Sakai my brother from another mother. But Saburo died in 2000 of a cerebral hemorrhage, but he was a very good man in his heart. And he's the atypical Japanese soldier you see in movies. This guy was the kind of guy who would come up to a strange child and pull candy out of his pocket. And in his limited English, he would say, "I hope you live well."
Wow. Wow. And the incident with the Dutch commercial airliner, that was not the only incident illustrating his honesty, his honor, his desire to be a human.
No, not at all. Many times in combat, he would shoot up American aircraft and he would actually fly alongside, much like our next guest. He would fly alongside and tell them, "I don't want to kill you," motioning, bail out, and give them the chance to bail out if they could. He didn't want to kill a helpless enemy.
Yeah, yeah. Very similar to Stigler and the story. Story there, right? There's another part of there's just you mentioned after the war. After the war, when Stigler and Charlie Brown became friends, I remember reading in the book, and it's been a while, there was a reunion where the crew that flew with Charlie Brown came and they met Franz Stigler, and they brought with them a lot of their family to illustrate the point that he saved not only those men, but the dozen or so family members who would never have been there had he shot down that plane. And
absolutely.
Even as I tell that story, I get chills up and down my back.
Franz told me that story too, and I could give you dozens of stories. I used to go to the German fighter pilot reunions, the Gemeinschaft der Jagdflieger, every year. I'm a member, and I would go to the reunions every year when the old guys are still alive. And every now and then, like Walter Krupinski, an old Russian dude showed up. I tracked down this guy. Short story, I managed to figure out who this guy was. I brought him to the reunion in Germany. Walter Krupinski saved his life when he was an 18-year-old fighter pilot. He could have killed him. He didn't. Let him bail out. And then the guy shows up in 1999 with his daughter, son-in-law, grandkids, and a great-grandchild. And they were talking through the interpreter, a Russian interpreter who spoke German and Russian. I don't speak Russian, I speak German. And the little girl, I was there when the little girl came up to Walter Krupinski, said, "Thank you for letting me live because you didn't kill my great-grandpa." And that brought everybody to tears at that moment.
Wow. Okay. We're going to tell one more story, this time one of Marilyn's stories, and then we'll take a break again after this next episode. Okay, Marilyn, George, is it Swainer? Is that the way?
George Swainer.
Yeah.
Yeah, he flew with the Royal Canadian Air Force, and I knew him. And I have to credit this story with him. It's from the chapter Cries in the Night of one of the books that Mike Everhart and I did. And it was always one of my favorite stories. In January of 1945, when Stalag Luft 3 was evacuated, the men that stayed behind were the infirm. There wasn't an infirmary there. And about a week or so later, they had to be taken out of the camp as well. And George was one of them. And he said the Russians, they could hear the bombing at night. They could see the airplanes flying over. They knew they were getting really, really close to the camp. And now by then, most of the camp was empty. And the ones that weren't too sick and could still walk around finally went to the barracks, and they were able to get food from leftover Red Cross parcels and that kind of thing. And one of the funny things he said is that a lot of the guys who couldn't carry precious things to them on the march had left notes to the Russians with their names and address, and asked after the war would they send, this book or this whatever, but I'm sure it never happened. But it was about February 3rd, they had to leave the camp. And one of the doctors who had been very kind to them in the camp had stayed by. He was a fairly young doctor. His family and his house, his family was killed. His house had been bombed by Allied bombing, and yet he was still very nice to the prisoners of war. Well, about that time, his wife had her first baby, a young German woman, and she was not going to be allowed to accompany him when the camp was evacuated. Now, the doctor knew that the Russians were moving in from the east. He knew how brutal they were, especially with women. And here he had just a newborn baby. And he was ordered out of the camp. And he stayed with the prisoners of war till they marched a couple of days. And since they left later, they didn't go to Spremberg as the prisoners had. They went to a siding in the woods somewhere. And there were two passenger cars, a string of box cars for the prisoners. And as they walked along, they had noticed that there was a figure walking behind them. Turned out to be this young woman with a newborn baby in a snowstorm. They had left the camp about midnight, and she was marching along, and somebody spotted her. And she was coming to say goodbye to her husband as he was going to get on that train. And they did force him to get on the train. One of the two passengers were overcrowded even for the German staff. And so they said their goodbyes, and her husband was forced into one of the passengers, and that was it for them. The prisoners that were the most sick were put onto the boxcars first. The others mingled around outside until they could see which car they were supposed to go into. And at that point, they noticed she was getting closer and closer to them. And almost without speaking, they looked at each other and realized that they needed to do something. So they sent word to the different groups that were gathered around the trains to try and urge her to come over and hide within the groups of the prisoners, which they were pretty successful at doing. And one of them gave her a hat. One of them gave her his greatcoat. And at that point, all the greatcoats were pretty much the same. So she blended right in. They actually were coats from Dunkirk that all came from Dunkirk. And so it came time, they put her on the train, and with her, she hid in the bottle. And this is a picture of the boxcar, the 40 and 8. Now, this is usually, it's actually was from World War I, a French train, a boxcar to hold either 8 horses or 40 human beings, but the Germans usually put about 60 in there. And they were on the train for probably at least 3 days. They went through Dresden. They had been strafed. They had a horrendous time, finally had to stop at one point and write in white paint. They traded something for some people for white paint to put POWs on the top of the train. And eventually it was headed to Nuremberg. And when they got to Nuremberg, Swainer was in the back of the train, and the guys in the front cars didn't realize she was there. So they all passed the word up to notify her husband that she was there with the baby. And eventually they were reunited in Nuremberg, but the doctor had to keep it very secret because there were a lot of Germans that didn't get to go that far, and the Russians probably killed them. They couldn't take everybody as far as the Germans went. So they kept it. He settled her in a very small village near there, and kept the secret that she was there with the newborn baby. And it was just a nice humanitarian story.
Yeah, yeah. And Swainer, of course, survives the war. I had this one picture out of order here. I'll go back to it.
There he is. Yeah.
I think he's speaking with a Royal Canadian Air Force fighter group, perhaps there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And do we know after the war what happened to the doctor, his wife, and the baby?
Well, they survived the war. So I've never heard, and he never heard. We really don't know, but he had the reputation of being very kind to the prisoners of war. So if there were ever war crimes or anything, I don't think he would be so much involved in those trials. And hopefully that they lived and had a happy life somewhere, but I don't know for sure. But you can imagine, I mean, the terror. It was a snowstorm when she marched out. It was almost blizzard conditions, and she's got a newborn that she's trying to keep warm, that she's trying to feed, and has to try and keep up with the prisoners of war, not knowing where she was going or what was going to happen to either one of them. had to be terrifying. Of course, it was worse. It would have been worse if she stayed and the Russians came into the camp.
I doubt they'd have survived.
Yeah, they did. No, they wouldn't have, not at all.
So incredible acts of bravery in this case on the part of Royal Canadian Air Force Flight Officer George Swainer and the other Allied prisoners who were part of the masquerade, if you will, part of hiding her on that trip. It's amazing that the baby survived.
It really is, because a lot of women who brought babies out at that time of the year, the babies, they couldn't keep them warm enough, and many of them died on trains, in the long processions of refugees that were on the roads. Many lost their babies.
Thank you, Marilyn.
Okay.
So let's stop again here and ask let people ask any questions, entertain any comments. Sean, anything we should address?
Colin, you answered another one of Doug's questions that maybe we could enlighten everybody about Hashimoto.
Yeah. Mochishiro Hashimoto, after he testified at Captain McVeigh's trial, where Admiral King wanted to court-martial him for losing his ship, which was incredible to anybody with an IQ in 3 digits, Hashimoto was brought in as a prosecution witness to try to convict McVeigh, but it kind of backfired a little bit, and Hashimoto felt that he was being dishonored and that McVeigh was being dishonored. And because of what happened during the war, and when Hashimoto knew of the war crimes committed by his country, he swore to never kill another living thing. He became a Shinto priest, and he swore to be a peaceful creature for the rest of his life.
Susan asked about the Buchenwald. Maybe we answered this. What was the reason for asking them not to discuss Buchenwald?
Well, there were several reasons. Marilyn knows from one side of it. The other side of it that I have is that because we were trying to reconcile with West Germany, it would have been bad form to illustrate the fact that, okay, yeah, Germans killed Jews, Slavs, prisoners of war of the Soviet military. But wow, we can't really have any outward display of newsworthy communication with regard to the Germans wanting to execute Americans, because we're trying to build this NATO organization, and that was part of it. And another part of it, I think, was pure shame on the part of the West Germans asking that it not be advertised. That's a supposition on my part. I can't prove it, but I think it was about saving face, and I think that was unfortunate for the veterans.
Yeah, and the Russians wanted Werner von Braun as badly as the Americans did, so a lot of stuff was covered up at that point, and they didn't want to advertise that, I think. Yeah.
Well, and Werner von Braun was working on the Redstone program, Gemini, Apollo, and it would have really derailed the entire effort if bad publicity hit von Braun and Dornberger and those guys.
Okay. Anything else before we move on to a couple more stories?
Hold on one sec. Colin, you said we should do a juxtaposition show on war crimes. And Greg Yost responded, rather interesting. The Nuremberg trials on medical experimentation serve as the basis for most of today's bioethics. I mean, the entire field, not simply involving wartime matters. So yeah, maybe we could look at doing a program about the juxtaposition of war crimes later on in the year.
And bear in mind, I have a video on Josef Mengele. I knew his son Rolf quite well, and but people seem to forget that Japan had Unit 731 and Unit 100. They performed horrific biological experiments on prisoners of war and civilians.
Colin, I think I read somewhere that Mengele drowned in the ocean. Is that true?
Yeah, he had a stroke and drowned off the coast of Brazil. I knew his son, Rolf. Rolf actually represented me as an attorney in Germany. Anyway, but I knew Rolf quite well. And yeah.
For everybody.
Yeah, so, and I have a video on Mengele on my YouTube channel, and I also have a video on the Unit 731, which would be pretty good viewing for anybody wanting to see what the war crimes were really about, and how the Japanese got a total pass, and the Germans kind of like paid a price for it.
I'm planning on doing towards the end of the year, because I think the Nuremberg trials started in November, December of 45.
46. I believe they started in 46 with the first trial of Alfred Jodl. I mean, yeah, I think so.
Well, regardless, I mean, I would like to address sort of as an 80th anniversary program, the Nuremberg trials, which I don't think you can cover in one show, one program. That and the Japanese war trials, which did occur then in 46. So, okay, let me go back to the next story. And we'll get this as one of Colin's story based on a book that he wrote. Here we go. Colin, tell us about the Star of Africa, Hans Marseille.
Yeah, Hans Joachim Marseille. Yeah, he was a fascinating character, and I had the great privilege of knowing about 40 people who knew him during the war, interviews of mine. 20 pilots who flew with him, including about 4 Allied pilots he shot down who survived, one of whom was a POW, but his guest of honor after he shot him down. Marseille was a very interesting character. He was a juvenile delinquent, borderline criminal. He had a criminal record of stealing a motorcycle, and let's just leave it at that. The book tells it all, and the second edition of my book, Expanded, comes out this September. But Marseille's father was a World War I pilot who knew a Pearl Marie recipient named Eduard von Schleich, and Schleich was a legend. He was called the Black Baron in World War I, a highly honorable fighter pilot, and Marseille's father told him war's coming. He said, Hitler's a lunatic. He's going to get us into a war, and you'd better go to the Air Force or the Navy or something. You won't survive in the infantry. I saw it from the air in the last war. So he enlists in the Air Force. He graduates #1 in gunnery, #1 in aerobatics, #1 in tactical flying. Problem was, he broke all the rules and was on restriction most of the time. He would have been kicked out long ago, but von Schleich knew his father and was his friend, so he gave him a pass. Marseille ends up going to France and Holland and then France, and he flies during the Battle of Britain. He gets 7 victories, but he violates all the rules of combat. He gets fired from Herbert Ehlefeld, his commanding officer, who I knew. Couldn't take him anymore. Passed him on to his next commanding officer, Johannes Steinhoff, who I knew. Steinhoff finally got rid of him after a Gestapo major wanted to arrest him for sleeping with his daughter. So then he ends up going to Yugoslavia and Greece and then North Africa, where he became a legend. And this is Marseille in the driver's seat. Kugelbauer is behind Marseille. Just to the left of Marseille is my old friend Werner Schroer, who flew with him, who I knew. And so Marseille goes to North Africa. He's still a mediocre pilot. He has like 10 or 12 victories. He's shot down about 5 or 6 times, not a good ratio. But then he adheres to his training regimen. He gets better. He practices. And then finally, he's racking up kills. But what makes him more legendary than his 158 aerial victories is the fact that his first violation of German military law was when he shot down a man named Patrick Byers. He shot down Byers. Byers bails out of his Hurricane, burned up. And Marseille and Schroer and Ludwig Franziskett, who I knew, go pick him up. He's burned over 80% of his body. They take him back to their camp. They call in a medevac flight on a Ju-52 to get him to the hospital. For 3 days, Marseille's there with him. Marseille speaks fluent English, Russian, Greek. English, French, Greek, Latin. I mean, the guy's, he speaks these languages. He has no barrier with Byers, who's South African. He's talking. They become good friends, and Byers forgives him for shooting him down. And he fills out Byers' POW card. He escorts Byers to the Derna hospital. He gets there, comes back, and then he jumps into his Messerschmitt without authorization. His commanding officer this time is Edward Neumann, who was a very good friend of mine. He jumps into the cockpit, cranks it up, and writes a note and flies to 250 Squadron, Australia. He flies and drops the note and says, Patrick Byers is okay. He's in hospital. Best regards, the Luftwaffe. Well, everybody's like happy, jubilant. Okay, now we know where Byers is. He was missing in action. And the 2 men on the ground who read that note were friends of mine that I interviewed, Mike Judd and Jeffrey Morley Mower. So Marseille flies back. 2 weeks later, Marseille gets the call on the phone that Patrick Byers died of his wounds. Marseille has a mental breakdown. He cries, and he can't. Norman takes him off operations for a couple of days because it just tears him apart. And so then he jumps into his fighter without authorization, flies back to 250 Squadron, drops a note saying, Pat Byers died of his wounds with great regrets. The Luftwaffe drops it over the airfield, and then he flies back to his unit. A few months go by, February 42 this time. He shoots down a guy named, he shoots down a fellow by the name of, oh God, I can't remember. Graham Buckland, George Graham Buckland. He shoots down Buckland. Buckland goes to bail out of his aircraft, but at the tail of his aircraft strikes him. His parachute never opens. And then Marseille and Francisquet and Schroer and others go and find his body, but it's in no man's land. They can't pick him. They can't take him in the vehicle. They don't have enough fuel for the weight and all of what, something like that. So Marseille takes his personal documents, his pay book, his all of his stuff. He goes back, jumps into his fighter, writes a note, and takes all the personal effects, including his wristwatch and a fountain pen, and flies over 250 Squadron and writes a note, say, I killed this guy, Graham Buckland, with regrets. Please give these to his mother. Salute to a gallant enemy. And he drops it over the airfield again, third trip. And then he flies back. Well, this time Hermann Goering found out that the German intelligence realized that they got the message that this German pilot keeps flying to this airfield, telling him about the people he's killed or shot down. And Goering gives him a direct order. He says, I will court-martial you if you ever do this again. And then Marseille's thinking, well, he tells Neumann, well, he can't really be that serious about it. So I'm not going to obey that order. And so then he takes off, and he does it 3 or 4 more times. And then he allows a lot of guys. The 158 aircraft he shot down, only about 112 died. He had let them bail out, or he let them crash land. And if the pilot crash landed or bailed out and he was hurt or something, Marseille would fly to the airfield and say, here are the coordinates, go pick up your pilot. He's not going to survive if you don't. And that's the kind of guy he was. He goes back to Berlin. He gets the Knight's Cross. Before he goes to Berlin, gets his oak leaves and swords to the Knight's Cross. Before that, he has to see Mussolini to get the Italian Medal of Honor. Then he goes to see Hitler to get the German Medals of Honor. And then he goes to a party, and then Karl Wolff, who I interviewed, was there. They were talking with Globachnik, who I mentioned before, and some others. And then what happens is Marseille overhears the discussions of Auschwitz and how they're processing 4,000 to 5,000 Jews a day. He takes that information back to North Africa, and nobody believes him except Werner Schroer, because Schroer's mechanic already heard this. He already heard the story from his mechanic's brother. He was in the SS and had a mental breakdown on Christmas Eve, and he said, we're killing Jews, we're murdering Jews, you wouldn't believe what we're doing to these people. So that's what happened. So Marseille is an anti-Nazi. He's anti-Nazi as hell. And I could go into an entire hour, but I have a 30-minute video on Marseille on my YouTube channel called The Pilot Who Defied Hitler. I suggest you watch it. It's phenomenal. And this is the very story we're turning into a feature film right now. Now, this photograph here was taken on September 29th, 1942. The reason it's important is because Marseille would die the next morning. And Ludwig Francisquet, with his Leica camera, took this photograph of his best friend the night before he died. And it's just kind of poignant. And it's in my book, of course. But
how did he die?
Well, he was escorting my late friend Kurt Kolmai, who was a Stuka commander in North Africa. Kurt Kolmai, the only guy in Finland, by the way, with a statue in his honor who's not a Finn. But Kurt Kulmai was flying a Stuka mission. Marseille was his escort, uneventful, no combat. He's flying back, and his 109 G2, which he didn't want to fly. In fact, he kept flying his 109F because he preferred it better. But Field Marshal Albert Kesselring showed the hell up and said to Neumann, why is he flying that old fighter? He has a new one delivered by Goering personally and Willy Messerschmitt. He should be flying it. The propaganda people are here with cameras and reporters. He should be flying this thing for the people back home. Neumann said he prefers it. It's a better aircraft. And he goes, no, you don't understand, Neumann. This is not a request. He will fly that aircraft. Well, he flew the aircraft the next couple of missions, and then the problem with that model was it had a gear lock mechanism issue. He had a cockpit fire. He went to bail out. The tail struck him like what happened with Buckland. He never opened his parachute, and so he died upon impact. And anyway, but that's his story. He was a very humane person. He really gave the finger to the Nazis. He gave a piano concert for the Nazi hierarchy from Hitler, Himmler, Goering, Bormann on down. He played all the classics for about an hour, the approved music of the Third Reich. And then he broke out into Scott Joplin's Ragtime and cleared the house. And Hitler said, "Get the hell, we're done, man. You know, we're done with this." You know,
Sounds like a guy we should have had a couple of beers with. He's not like a fun guy.
If he had survived the war, I'd have gotten drunk with him in a heartbeat.
Okay. We need to stop there on this story. And Sean, it's 8 o'clock, I think, about straight up. Do you want to take our station break? We'll come back. We have another story from Marilyn next, and we can take questions as well.
Sure thing. We'll thank our sponsors real quick. That'll be tobacco-free Adagio Health. I'm sure you guys have heard us speak of them before, but we're so appreciative of them supporting the VBC. They are dedicated to preventing and reducing tobacco use and educating people about tobacco hazards and advocating for healthier places to live, work, and play. Check them out at tobaccofree.adagiohealth.org. I'd also like to thank UPMC for Life. They can help you make sense of Medicare and get the answers and information you need, such as how to choose the Medicare Advantage plan that's right for you. They have plans designed by veterans for veterans that could save you money and get you more benefits. So check out all of your plan options by visiting upmchealthplan.com/Medicare. I'll put a link for our per program survey into the chat. It takes about 2 to 3 minutes. We watch these again very closely. We're having our next program committee meeting coming up soon. So we'll be reviewing these and making sure that we adapt as we move into the middle portion of this year. We have a VBC magazine. You can currently read the digital version of the current magazine, the Winter 2025 edition. That is on our website. Very easy. Just go to www.veteransbreakfastclub.org. At the top, you can scroll over magazine, click that, and you will find the digital version of the magazine. It is a free magazine, free print. So if you don't get it in your mailbox because we don't have your address, please send that to us. We will happily ship you a magazine. And if you would like more to be able to hand out at your community or give to your friends, we are happy to send you more than one. Just let us know how many. We have some programs coming up. So Monday night, there's a film screening and discussion. You have to register. As you can see, you have to register for this. So if you're planning to join us Monday night, it's going to be a great screening, a really great discussion afterwards. Please register. I'm going to put that into the chat whenever I get done with our station break. Click on the link. It's super easy. And then you'll find yourself with an email that you'll use then to access our Monday night program come Monday. We only do that for our film screenings because they do have to be closed from we don't stream them, obviously, to like YouTube as we do now. Next, Thursday night, more stories from the B-26 Marauder in World War II. Glenn, do you want to give us a preview of that?
Yeah, this is part 2 of the B-26 story that we put on back in November or so of last year. A couple of stories that we didn't get to. One of them is a fascinating story. Josh Murray and his grandfather, well, his grandfather's long gone, but Josh Murray's grandfather, I can't quite remember his first name right now, flew a B-26 out of Midway on June 4th, 1942. That's right, Battle of Midway, and flew with against the Japanese carriers and made an interesting pass over one of the carriers. And Josh has a great story about that. The other story is by a book, is via a book on a B-26 crewman who flew in Corsica, Sardinia, southern France. It's just a great story about this man's adventures flying a B-26. So yeah, honoring the B-26 guys next week.
Excellent. And looking forward to our Valentine's Day special on, it's an open conversation program on February 10th, the following Monday. And I'm really excited by this. The Yalta Conference will be speaking about the 80th anniversary on February 13th. This one I am very excited by, Glenn.
Well, I'm excited about it too. I will make an appeal to anybody that's on the program tonight. If they know of sort of a history professor, someone who's written a book on the Yalta Conference. I've been working on this for a month and I've come up a bit dry in trying to line up special guests. I wanted to have a panel of 3 experts on this and walk through the facts of the Yalta conference, the questions that we need to ask about the Yalta conference, and have a discussion about, what the results were. Really, really, this is the absolute most, maybe the second most important conference that occurred during World War II. And basically, this led to the results, the decisions that were made there really led towards the Cold War. I don't know if it could have been done any different, but that's what we want to sort of have a nice debate about.
Looks like Colin raised his hand in the chat that he can help us out with that. And
I've talked to Colin a bit about that, and I know Greg Yost would be another good member to have on. But I was trying to line up, in addition to our members who are always so loyal to us in this, I was trying to line up let's say an outsider. And I have a couple of people that are pending, and we'll see if that comes through in the next couple of weeks.
Dana Del Bianco says she might have a CMU professor that can help us out. So Dana, let us know, please. Thank you so much for making the connection.
Dana, you're my favorite friend. You're my best friend now. Please email us or email me and let me know who that CMU professor is, and I'll get in contact with him.
And I put the link for Monday night's program there in the chat. Just go ahead and click that if you plan on joining us for the film screening.
Real quick, one last thing here on the break. I know we've mentioned this before. We haven't shown this yet, but I'm going to show it now. Before we get to this trip, our trip to New Orleans is full. We have 30 people signed up to go to the World War II Museum. So it's full. It's full relative to the rooms we booked and the airlines we booked. If there's anybody else that would still like to go, it's a possibility, but it would be pending, making sure we can get the hotel room and the airline lined up. Okay. So we're going to begin to promote this trip. It's our second trip to Europe. The first one occurred, I believe, back in 2018, before I sort of came on board. Some of these pictures are from that 2-week guided tour of Europe. It's kind of the Band of Brothers trip that has been so popular over the years. We're much better priced than anybody else because they're not paying me $50,000 to be and Todd to be the speakers, to be the historians, unfortunately. These are shots from last year. That's Berchtesgaden, which I've never been to. I'm really looking forward to that. But real quick here, the itinerary is fly into London, a couple of days in London. We're actually going to take a overnight ferry from Southampton to Normandy. So we're going to recreate the invasion of Normandy. We're not going to get your feet wet or anything. Don't worry about that part. We'll spend a few days in Normandy, and then following the 101st Airborne Band of Brothers up to Eindhoven for Market Garden, and then down into Bastogne in Luxembourg for the Battle of the Bulge. We go through Heidelberg, we end up in Munich, and we go up to the Eagle's Nest. And then the very last day is a free day in Munich. And the challenge is, can anybody outdrink Colin with German beer? I haven't told you about that yet, Colin.
Ausgesprochen Bierversina. Yeah. Yeah, I love German beer. I lived in Germany for years, man. I love it. I have family there too, so.
I'm afraid to challenge you, Colin. We'd love it, obviously, if you could come. And I don't mean to put you on the spot or anything. We'll be rolling this out via email in a bigger way here as the next couple of weeks goes on, because usually these things, you're going to go in August. You got to start promoting this in now. So, okay, we're going to go back to our next story, which Marilyn is going to relate to us. If you let me get to the right spot. Well, I'm going to have to jump through this now. Sorry if I'm making anybody dizzy. Oh, Colin, I missed that one, but we're going to go on here. One of my favorite stories I've heard from you, Marilyn. I'm not quite sure why, but I really enjoyed this. As you know, I did a little bit of research and dug up a few other pictures that you had not sent me. But Irving Baum, tell us about Irving.
Irv was a good friend of mine. He was a B-24 bombardier, as my father was. So we were kind of kindred spirits for many years. and I used to see him at all the reunions. And he was the first, of course, to tell me this story, but he had been at Dulagla for interrogation and was scheduled to be shipped out and to go to Stalag Luft 3. And there was a bombing of the interrogation center. So normally the men would, there's Stalag Luft 3. Normally the men would fill out an ID card with all their information at the interrogation center. And they just got theirs partially filled out when the bombing started, and they were rushed out very quickly. He arrived at Stalag Luft 3, as did the father of my co-author, Mike Eberhardt, the same day that the Great Escape took place, which was a really bad time to get there. Normally at that camp, there was no SS there, Gestapo or whatever, but that day there was. This Gestapo had a strong presence there, and the whole camp was just in absolute chaos. The commandant knew that he was done. He was going to be leaving, and it was just a very emotionally electric situation there. The tension ran very high. Well, Irv and the rest of the men that went with him were taken into a place called the Vorlager, which was at the entrance of the camp. And that's where they had a building where they would take them and sit them at tables, and there were some German guards in there, and they would supervise. They would collect all these, they're kind of almost pink cards, and they had to fill them out. And since they had started, they really just had to finish filling out the cards. And Irv sat down at a table, and he was filling out his card, and a very, very young, very scared German guard was there, observing what was going on in the camp, having no idea what was going to happen, particularly to somebody who was Jewish. And Irv got to the line that wrote religion, and he started to write a J for Jewish. And without saying a word, the guard came over and saw him, and very quietly he just shook his head, no, don't do that. And Irv thought, well, maybe he was supposed to write H for Hebrew. So he started to approach the card again to write it. And very quickly, the guard took his pencil, and he took that J and made it into a P and wrote for Protestant. And I have talked to a few other Jewish POWs that had similar things happen, particularly around that time when it was very dangerous. And so Irving, he never got over that this young German would help him do that. And he became a prisoner. And many people ask, what was it like for Jewish prisoners of war at Stalag Luft 3? And they said they were treated absolutely no differently than anybody else in the camp, no matter what religion they were. So he carried around that card for a long time, and he would bring it out at prisoner of war reunions and tell his wonderful story. After the war, he lived in San Francisco. He had a vineyard out there, and he had a wine he developed called The Prisoner. And he had told me about it all the time. And the day that he died, I happened to be in a Costco, and I looked up, and there was his wine. I had never seen it before. It was in a Costco store here in Ohio. And he was very proud of that wine. And I think it's like $50 a bottle or something, even at Costco. So, but he was a very good friend of mine, and I still miss him. Irv was a great guy.
Yeah. Is there any evidence, not only in Stalag Luft 3, but any of the German prisoner of war camps, that Jewish prisoners were identified, treated poorly, any kind of, activity that against the Jewish prisoners?
I'm unaware of it, but there is a story that has gone around for years about at a prisoner of war camp. I think it did happen somewhere, but everybody claims it as their own. That when a German guard came out with the new guys, and he said, how many of you are Jewish? Step forward. And everybody in that group, Jewish or not, stepped forward. That they were all going to band together, and they were all really brothers in arms, and they weren't about to turn it over any of their Jewish friends to the Germans. And I've heard it happened at Solid Glue 3. I heard it happened at Solid Glue 1, the other officers' camp, and many other camps. So it's hard to say where it came from. It's kind of become a legend, but I think it probably did happen somewhere.
Yeah. Was this German guard ever identified, or did Irv ever figure out who he was? Or
No, I'm sure he would have liked to have known that, but he was very young. He was very scared, and he had no idea what the Gestapo was going to do in that camp that day. And he felt compelled to protect the Jewish prisoners that were coming in.
Yeah. Wow.
It speaks well of him.
Yeah, I mean, he took a huge risk. Had some
Took a
office.
huge risk. He sure did. Yeah.
He'd have been on the Eastern Front in a nanosecond.
Yeah, and all of these cards went with them when they went to Stalag 7A in Moosburg, where they were all liberated, and they were in an administrative building. And when they were liberated by Patton, they broke into the building and they all got their cards. And I assumed this was one of them, that he found it, there, and he has been able, because that's the original card that he had. But they all found their cards and passed them out to their friends, and they became souvenirs at that point.
By the way, Marilyn, I haven't asked you yet, so I'll ask you in public so I can put you on the spot. And I know I'll get a yes answer no matter what. Come, April or May sometime, I'd love to do a program with you and maybe Nancy about, the 80th anniversary of the freeing of the POWs.
Oh, yeah, down in Moosburg.
Moosburg.
Yeah,
all the
yeah, sure. Great. Sounds good to me.
I got it on record. It's public now. Thank you.
Okay. I can tell you how it really happened.
Okay. As opposed to the
yeah. Masters are there.
One more stop. I'd like to get one more story in if we can. The next one I think is another compelling story, this one from Colin. But any questions, anything we should address in the chat room, Sean?
No, I'm learning German. Looks like Colin's typing in German, so I'm trying to decipher everything that he's saying. But no, please continue.
Okay. Let me go back then. So this next story, we actually mentioned this submariner, German U-boat commander, a couple of weeks ago during our discussion on the war in the Caribbean, or the Caribbean. I have to get that right. Captain Werner Hartenstein. Did I get anywhere close, Colin? Hartenstein?
Correct, Hartenstein.
Yeah. After all, my last name is Flickinger. So, okay, tell us about Captain Werner Hartenstein.
Werner Hartenstein was a career naval officer. He was a very interesting guy, highly educated, spoke, I think, 6 languages, and could also read Braille. He was a very conscientious officer. And although what he did on September 12th, 1942 became legendary, he was not unique. There were many U-boat commanders like him who would sink a ship and then surface and then give rafts, food, a compass. They would give support. They would say, okay, go this way for about 3 or 4 days and hopefully, you'll get picked up or you'll reach shore. The U-boat commanders in general were not ruthless bastards, despite the propaganda. I interviewed 12 U-boat commanders. I was very good friends with 3 of the top U-boat commanders in history, and they all knew Hartenstein. They said he was a very humane character. On September 12th, 1942, he tracked and sank the Laconia, which was a British liner pressed into military service as a troop transport, legitimate target of war. He sank it, but what he found out when he surfaced was that it carried, over 1,000 passengers. A lot of them were women and children, Italian prisoners of war, and so he surfaced, and the ship was going down. It finally sank, so he dispensed all kinds of. He gave all their food. I mean, his crew would have starved, basically. He gave their food, their water, he gave a compass. But what he did most importantly was he broadcast in the open. He violated the most common military dicta, which was he broadcast in the open in English. He broadcast, "I have sunk the RMS Laconia. Please bring support for survivors." Well, the Royal Navy picked that up within 20 minutes. So did Berlin. Dönitz was livid. He was like losing his mind. And the British Royal Navy said, okay, fine. And he also broadcast, "We will not fire upon any ship helping in the rescue of these women, children, and these survivors." But what happened was that the Royal Navy, someone, I don't know who, decided to let the Americans know. And the Americans launched a B-24 out of North Africa, which, no, I think it was out of Ascension. Anyway, the B-24 came in, saw 3 U-boats on the surface because he had called in U-506 and U-507 from the Wolfpack to help with survivors. The decks were crowded with civilians, women and children, including the wife of the governor of Malta. And so the B-24 saw the U-boats crowded with people, probably not really realizing what they were seeing, and began dropping bombs and tried to sink the U-boats. Well, during this entire time, which lasted about 12 hours before the B-24 even arrived, Hartenstein had radioed on the Enigma machine, which was already compromised, as we know, and to Dönitz, and Dönitz said, "Save your ship, save your comrades, abandon the rescue." But he tried to rescue these people. So did 506 and 507 and an Italian submarine that arrived to try to save the civilians. But the bombing meant that he had to save his ship and his crew. So they gave them what they could. They had life preservers, lifeboats, whatever they could give them, rafts. They submerged and then took off. Hartenstein's boat, U-156, was damaged. He couldn't return. He had to get back to base. 506 and 507 were okay. They came back the next day and tried to pick up more survivors. But it was very dangerous because now the Allied forces knew where the U-boats were operating through Enigma and also through the open broadcast. Well, that situation was very dynamic for the war because from that point forward, Hitler got personally involved and said he would execute the next U-boat commander who tried to save any damn body, because it's not worth losing a U-boat and your crew to save even civilians, women, and children, because the Allies have no morality and whatever. So that event by that B-24 killed tens of thousands of people who would have been alive after U-boats sank them because of the Hitler order.
Wow. Wow. What a mistake. And what happens to Hartenstein? Is he reprimanded in some way?
He was reprimanded. He went back to Germany. He was reprimanded by Dönitz, but he was given his Knight's Cross by Hitler by saying, "Look, I understand you're wanting to be humane. A lot of these people in the water were Italian prisoners of war. They're allies." He wanted to save lives. He wasn't a killer. He wanted to save lives. So Hitler said, "But never do it again." And anyway, Hartenstein later was killed when his U-boat was depth charged and sunk with all lives lost. But it's just a tragic end to a guy who tried to do the right thing.
Yeah. Okay. We've got one more story, but again, I'm kind of sensitive to making sure we get anybody's comments or questions in. So let's stop again, and we'll see if we can get to the last story. The intent kind of tonight was, as you know, we get into these war stories that are just difficult to tell. Horrible to tell in so many cases, with so many people dying, wounded, mentally, emotionally wounded. Some of those scars last forever. And I suppose part of the reasoning for getting into these kind of stories tonight about human beings on all sides of the conflict was perhaps to give some relief to us all from those more difficult stories to tell. And realize that in any war, and I'm sure we could tell as many stories about this sort of event in World War I, in the Vietnam War, in any war, there's always, a bit of humanity that comes through. So I hope everybody understands that and agrees with that. Questions, comments?
Rich Kensinger has his hand up. You're unmuted,
Can
Rich.
you
Go
hear
ahead.
me?
Yep.
Yes.
This topic for me, as a clinical psychologist, as an ER medic, shatters me. I do extensive clinical research on combat trauma. I've counseled a number of soldiers, combatants, who have confronted having to kill other human beings. So I find this topic devastating. I was an ER medic. My mission was to save lives. I worked a number of years as a clinical psychologist. My job was to save lives. So I find this topic to be devastating.
Devastating? I thought it might be.
No, it's devastating. Trust me, as a clinical psychologist and an Air Force medic, my training is to do no harm. And I still abide by that, even though I'm retired. So I'm telling you, I've counseled actual combatants, and they live with this every day. So my reaction is very different
Okay.
because of my training. So thanks for hearing me out.
Okay. Thank you. And I see I just unmuted. Is that Rich?
Yes, good evening. This is a little different. You had it on a little bit ago about your tour to actually France, and then basically the Dick Winter tour. Next, the 9th of February, and I sent Sean an email. I'm not very good at the typing back and forth. I'm a grunt. But the 9th of February, Warren Goss joins our friend Edward Cottrell at 100 years old. So we have a little bit of time. I know Sean, I did send it to Sean. I'm going to ask people, especially these great folks listening to this, watching this, to send. I sent an email with the email address where Warren Goss could be reached. So it's pretty cool. We had a birthday party last year for Ed Cottrell for his 102nd, and I'm still enjoyed that. This year, it's Warren Goss's birthday. And Warren's been a dear friend of mine for many years, and he is well known. So unfortunately, I had to ask Ed, or basically, we're running out of room. We were talking about 175. We're at 250 now, and I have to stack people on top of each other. So I just wanted people to know that there are some really great guys that make it to 100. So thank you. I didn't mean to interrupt. There's nothing to do with the topic tonight, but I may not be on next week. Although this is interesting. I am not, as you know, the only thing I know about airplanes is I know how to jump out of them. Other than that, I don't know anything about airplanes.
Jump out of a perfectly good airplane.
Oh, no. There are not anything as a perfectly good airplane. So, especially in the Army. But thank you. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I think this is important.
Not an interruption whatsoever. We appreciate you bringing that up to our members, our audience. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. It's my honor to know him, as well as Ed. They're terrific human beings.
Well, in fact, I think I can say this. Warren Goss and 2 or 3 of his family members are coming with us to New Orleans on the World II Museum trip. So
that's correct.
We'll have a couple martinis with them. Okay. Anybody else?
Bob Von Barganas says Marilyn or Colin interviewed George Rubin of Medford, New Jersey.
No, I'm not familiar with the name. Was he a prisoner of war?
I don't know him either.
Bob, I'll ask you to unmute.
George will turn 100 this May. He was a prisoner of war. Interesting man. I was supposed to get in to interview him, and then I got sick. The interesting story about George was that his crew was very disillusioned when the Eighth Air Force changed the strategy from bombing precisely targets to hitting civilian areas, and they were about to mutiny, and they had decided to do that when after their next mission. Well, their next mission put them into a POW camp. He would be very. I can give you his contact number. He's interesting man, very interesting man. He's a retired physician.
Yeah, Bob, please send me his contact information. I'll share it with Marilyn and Colin, and maybe we can. He was a 8th Air Force guy, down POW.
Yeah, he lives in Medford Lees, which is a retirement home in Medford, New Jersey.
Well, New Jersey, you know, we make exceptions. We have people from New Jersey on now and then, Bob. It's on a case-by-case basis.
Well, when I moved here, my sister said to me, "Bob, do you realize you're moving to a place where they have Jersey drivers?" Or a better one yet was when I came on a cruise ship from Canada, from Quebec City, and you get to what's the my old age is catching up on me. When you get to Bar Harbor, the customs agents come on board. I don't know if anybody's ever had this experience, and they don't exactly. They make you go through this thing, what they call a customs procedure, and they do it in this big ballroom. So as you walk across, they have you walk across a ballroom floor, and there are customs agents across the floor. And they tell you which one to go. Go to the third guy or the fourth guy. So I walk up to the guy, and the guy says, "What state are you from?" And I said, "New Jersey." And he looked at me and he said, "Why?"
I served with a guy in the Marine Corps, and he said he was from New Jersey. He was from Elizabeth City, and his name was Roger. And he said, "You know, there's only two types of people come from New Jersey: escapees and evacuees."
Well, I'm a refugee off the streets of New York, so.
Okay, we've hit the witching hour, a minute or two beyond. Marilyn, I'm sorry, we're not going to get to the two dogs. That
Dog story. Yeah, the dog story. I'll save it.
We'll find another time.
Yeah. In me.
Maybe we can do the Wojtek.
We should do an animal one. We got the dog story. We got Wojtek, the Polish bear.
You mentioned something. You're working on I don't know, a video or something about entertainers in World War II. Was that it?
You mean me?
Yeah, Colin.
Yeah, we're doing a series on Hollywood celebrities who are World War II veterans. Some who were veterans. Well, we have one on Jimmy Stewart already. We have one on Lee Marvin. But we're doing a series on some of the people who were Hollywood icons, who were veterans of the war, who became Hollywood stars later. And I'm working on not just World War II, but also Korea and things, but veterans of all conflicts. Clint Eastwood, for instance, who was really a hero in his own right. And Charles Bronson, who received a Purple Heart as a B-29 crewman. Yeah, we're doing a series on the Hollywood icons who were veterans. Chris Christopherson, you know.
Yeah. Lots and lots of names. That'd be fascinating.
Colin and I are working heavily right now on the bear story of the Polish bear that fought with the Polish army.
Oh yeah, Wojtek, that's going to budget, and we have production interest in turning that into a feature film.
Yeah.
Wow.
Script's done.
Well, I think we're about to sign off, unless we have anybody else waving their hand or interested in speaking up.
Yeah, I want to say one thing. Ed Cottrell, you're a hero, man. I love aviation. I love World War II veterans. You live in Asheville. I live on the East Coast of North Carolina. We've got to slam a few beers, buddy.
Is Ed still on?
I don't see him, but we'll definitely get that message out to him. Thanks, Colin.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, for being on tonight. I hope you enjoyed the programs and the stories. Colin and Marilyn, you're exceptional people. And we thank you for your effort on the part of the Veterans Breakfast Club. And good night, everybody. Sean, thank you so very much.
Of course. Thank you, everybody. Remember